This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review. Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review, a program dedicated to books and ideas and important issues of all kinds, brought to you by the Van Leer Jerusalem Institute, which promotes humanistic, democratic, and liberal values in the social discourse in Israel. If you like what we do, please consider becoming a subscriber by giving to our Patreon campaign. You'll find a link on the Tel Aviv Review website and in the show summary on your podcast app. I'm Dahlia Shenlin. Sadly, I'm speaking to you alone today from outside Birmingham, England. Every week we talk about books and research and articles or ideas that have caught our attention. Today's show is going to be a Tel Aviv Extra. My guest is Nicholas Blanford. He is an expert on Hezbollah. He's the Beirut correspondent for the Christian Science Monitor. He's a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council and the author of two books, Killing Mr. Lebanon from 2006 and Warriors of God, Inside Hezbollah's 30-Year Struggle Against Israel from 2011. Today we'll be talking about the fact that both Israel and Hezbollah seem to be preparing any day now for the next war, why it will be the worst war ever, and why it might not happen at all. Nicholas Blanford, thank you for being on the show.
Thank you. Very nice to be here.
Why does war between Hezbollah and Israel appear to be so imminent right now? We're getting analyses all the time in Israel for months now saying that it could happen any day. What is this war actually going to be about?
Well, I think, since the last war ended in 2006 in such an inconclusive manner, there's been an expectation of a round two ever since. And if you look back over the last 11 and a half years, certainly in the spring of 2007, 2008, 2009, there was a lot of speculation in the Israeli and Lebanese media that, is this summer going to be when we have round two? Now, of course, it didn't materialize. Then in 2011, the war in Syria began, or at least the uprising against the Assad regime in Syria began, and it soon morphed into a very brutal and bloody civil war. And certainly in Lebanon, attention kind of switched from the southern border with Israel and towards the eastern border with Syria. So this whole issue of another war breaking out imminently with Israel kind of receded, not entirely from the headlines, but it dropped down and the Syria war took precedence. Now, however, we're into a new situation in Syria. The civil war aspect of the conflict, with the Assad regime being challenged by an armed opposition, is gradually declining. It's evident that Assad is going to prevail with the assistance of his key allies, Russia and Iran. And instead, the war is heading into a more complicated, multinational kind of conflict. So you have the uncertainties of that. Plus, you also have... And sorry,
just the uncertainties of that are keeping Hezbollah preoccupied? Is that why this
relates?
No,
well, I was going to go into this a bit more, but I mean, if we look at why are we uncertain about where things are going in Syria and what it means, we have seen a kind of what we call the rules of the game between Hezbollah and the Israelis, which undergo changes periodically, and then the status quo applies for perhaps a few more years, and then there may be another little change. So back in January of 2013, the Israelis staged airstrikes against suspected Hezbollah targets in Syria for the first time. And when that happened, everyone put up their hands and said, oh my God, this could trigger a war. What's going to happen? Then we very quickly saw with repeated Israeli airstrikes that the Assad regime and Hezbollah were actually going to do nothing. Then in February 2014, there was an airstrike that occurred just inside Lebanon's border. It was in a very remote area. It's an area that was under Hezbollah's control. So folks in the Bekaa Valley, they saw the flashes of light at night. They heard the explosions. Hezbollah radio very quickly came on and said, well, look, it was actually in Syria. It was just across the border, therefore nothing to do with us. Now, nobody could disprove that because on the Lebanese side, you couldn't just walk up and have a look because this was a Hezbollah-controlled area. It took 36 hours for Hezbollah to mull what had actually happened, and then they released a statement. And the statement essentially said that these airstrikes did occur on Lebanese soil. They hit one of our facilities. Thanks be to God, none of our people were hurt. There was some infrastructural damage. We are going to retaliate. And there followed over the next few weeks a number of anonymous attacks or attempted attacks, IED ambushes and the like, occurring in the Golan Heights, not from Lebanon, but in the Golan Heights. And it culminated with the wounding of 4 Israeli soldiers in an IED ambush near Majd al-Shams, and then things calmed down. So this was the kind of the rules of the game being reset. So the Israelis understood that, well, we can hit Hezbollah in Syria and we can get away with it. We hit them in Lebanon, there's going to be some form of retaliation.
But not necessarily full escalation, because that
Not necessarily
died down.
full escalation. So now we've got into a situation where in the last year, the Israelis have expanded their target set in Syria from not just Hezbollah-related targets, but to suspected targets of Iran. So, of course, it's a red line for the Israelis, and they stated this many times, to see an Iranian military entrenchment in Syria. And there are some indications that this is underway. So we've seen 2 or 3 airstrikes over the past year, over the past 6-7 months, actually, that have targeted what appear to be Iranian-related facilities. So there is that aspect, first of all, this expansion of the target set. The second thing is that the Syrians have started firing back now. So since last April, they've been firing anti-aircraft missiles at Israeli jets. We had the incident last April when one of these anti-aircraft missiles was shot down. Parts of the engine of this SA-5 crashed into the Golan Heights, part into Jordan. And last month, of course, we had the F-16 was shot down. And this was the first Israeli aircraft, I believe, to have been shot down in action since 1982. So this obviously was a very significant event. Now, the crew bailed out and they landed safely in Israel. But what would have happened if they'd bailed out and landed in South Lebanon and they got captured by Hezbollah, or even in Syria and got paraded by the Assad regime through the streets of Damascus? And this is where we get into a potential escalatory cycle that could get out of control before both sides dial it back. You know, the reason we've had peace, or calm at any rate, for the last 11 and a half years, particularly along the blue line between the Lebanon-Israel border, is that there is a very strong balance of deterrence. Both sides know that the next war is going to be of an order of magnitude that will make 2006 look like a walk in the park.
Why is the situation so different from 2006? What's the difference in the type of war that would be waged now?
Because both sides recognize that the 2006 war ended inconclusively. Hezbollah was able to claim a divine victory. They put up an impressive military performance in South Lebanon, but they exposed a lot of their new weaponry, a lot of their tactics, the whole underground bunker networks that they had. This was a mistake by Hezbollah that this war occurred in the first place. They miscalculated the Israeli government's reaction to the abduction of 2 soldiers along the blue line. By the same token, the war was a wake-up call for the Israeli military. They did not perform particularly well during the war, and it was an embarrassment. So both sides, I think, have recognized almost an inevitable round 2 at some point, and they've both been preparing.
Almost to like make up for what didn't go so well for each side the first time?
Well, yes, but I think that, you know, there's certainly unfinished business from the Israeli side. And from the Hezbollah side, they recognize that, you know, they see the Israelis preparing for another war. I mean, this is what armies do. You prepare for the next war. So they've been retraining the Israeli army for land maneuvers. You know, they really hadn't had much experience since the end of the Israeli occupation in South Lebanon in 2000 with this kind of fighting a guerrilla army, which Hezbollah is. And Hezbollah, by the same token, they've expanded massively since 2006 in terms of numbers, in terms of technological communications, in terms of weaponry, particularly the acquisition of longer-range rockets now fitted with guidance systems that really dwarf what they had even in 2006.
And where have they acquired those missiles from?
They acquire them from many sources, certainly from Iran. They acquire systems from Syria. There are a number of longer-range missile systems that have been tinkered with by the Iranians, by the Syrians, to, you know, playing around with the size of the payload, the warhead, for instance, expand the size of the warhead, reduce the range, and vice versa, trying to improve guidance systems all the time. I think one of the key requirements that Hezbollah has been focusing on is to make their missiles more and more accurate. So in 2006, the missiles they were firing and rockets into Israel were unguided. So, you know, they are a mass area kind of weapon. You fire lots of them and you hope some at least hit the target. Now what Hezbollah is hoping to do is be able to fire fewer long-range missiles and hit specific targets, whether in Tel Aviv, whether military targets, infrastructure targets, and so on. So there is a sense that both sides are gearing up for this round 2. But because of the very fact that they have made these preparations, it's acting as a deterrence. So from the Lebanese side, Hezbollah understands that Lebanon is going to get turned into a car park in the next war. And Hezbollah is not in a rush to start something with Israel that is going to have that end result, with all the Lebanese at the end of the war pointing their fingers at Hezbollah and said, what did you do? What did you do that for? Now, on the Israeli side, I think the Israelis understand that the impact Israel is going to receive in the next war from Hezbollah is going to dwarf anything Israel has seen since 1948. The kind of thing we're looking at, Hezbollah guys crossing the border by land, quite possibly by sea and by air as well on hang gliders. You're going to have sub-ballistic missiles with guidance systems smashing into specific targets in Tel Aviv. Israel will grind to a halt for the duration. There'll be no civilian air traffic, no civilian maritime traffic. People won't be able to go to schools, they won't be able to go to work, and so on. In the past conflicts, the theatre of conflict was essentially defined by the range of Hezbollah's missiles. So traditionally, it was a line of, in northern Israel, Kiryat Shimona to Nahariya. In the 2006 war, it dropped a little bit further south to essentially the Haifa line. But in the next war, all of Israel is under Hezbollah's rocket coverage.
Straight through to the south.
In Israel, the main target areas would be essentially, I suppose, a line from a little south of Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. There's not an awful lot more beyond that.
A lot of open space.
Exactly. And they have the ability now, they believe, to fire missiles to that depth. But by the same token, the theatre of conflict in Lebanon is no longer just going to be related to South Lebanon. It's going to be all the way up to the northern border with Syria, because you can't expect Hezbollah, given the range of their missiles, to stuff them all in South Lebanon. They don't need to anymore. They can scatter them around the entire territory of Lebanon to fire.
Well, let me ask you this. This certainly sounds apocalyptic. I am definitely scared of such a war. It seems to me that the Israelis, as you point out, have laid down their red lines and explained the kinds of reasons why they might be pulled into a war or even, in any case, be involved in a war. What is Hezbollah's interest in a war with Israel, given all of this, given how extreme this could be? What would they be fighting for? I mean, if Hezbollah was established or emerged as, resistance to Israeli occupation in Lebanon, what are they fighting for now? Do they really believe that they will wipe Israel off the map, take over Jerusalem, or some other sort of strategic victory in the Middle East?
Well, ideologically, the destruction of Israel, the liberation of Jerusalem, remains one of their fundamental pillars.
But does it remain a realistic pillar for them? They really believe it could happen?
Some believe it. Now, if you go to the leadership cadres and sit down with them quietly in the evening over a cup of cocoa and say, come on, do you really believe this? Maybe they would give you a different answer, I don't know. But certainly the cadres believe this. And I hear this all the time from the Hezbollah guys, that they believe the next war is going to be a decisive war. There's going to be a clear winner and a clear loser. They don't necessarily say that we're going to be the winner, but there will be a winner and a loser. Now, Hezbollah, of course, they've expanded from beyond a role of being a Lebanese resistance force against Israel. They are now a regional military machine. They've become the greatest enabler of Iranian power projection across the Middle East. So obviously they're serving in Syria. They've been fighting there since late 2012, 2013. They're operating in Iraq in much, much smaller numbers, mainly in a training and advisory role. This is both the Syria and Iraq conflicts. Hezbollah's leadership has admitted to their presence there.
I think in 2014 you wrote an article that, quote, Hezbollah may be the most formidable non-state armed actor in the world.
Yes, exactly. That's still true. They're also active in Yemen. This is still a clandestine mission that hasn't been admitted to by Hezbollah's leadership, but they're playing a similar role to the one in Iraq, where they are providing guidance, training, and the like. So they are very, very busy outside the 3-decade-plus struggle with Israel. But they have not taken their eyes off the ball with Israel. Even at the height of the fighting in Syria a couple of years ago, they were still keeping a lot of their crack forces down in South Lebanon or scattered around the Bekaa Valley, and their eyes were pointed south towards Israel in anticipation. I think the Hezbollah leadership has always... They haven't been able to rule out the possibility that somebody may wake up one day in Israel and say, you know what, we're never going to have a better time to go after Hezbollah now when they're preoccupied with Syria. We can go in, do a rampage, knock them back 10 years, and then come back out again. So they have had to bear that in mind, even at the height of the conflict in Syria. Now, more recently, because of the speculation that we could be coming closer to a war, and another factor in all this, which I haven't mentioned, of course, is that we have a new administration in the US. So the years of Obama and the kind of more softly approach to Iran, which resulted in the nuclear deal, is over. Now you've got an administration that is stuffed full of anti-Iranian people, increasingly so now with the appointment of John Bolton as National Security Advisor and Mike Pompeo coming into the State Department.
And what impact does that have? Does that sort of is that like a provocative statement already against Hezbollah?
Well, I think it's more than a provocative statement. The Trump administration has made clear that they want to roll back Iranian influence across the Middle East. This was stated very clearly right at the beginning of Trump's presidency. We had several months after that with not much substance to follow, but I think gradually we're seeing a crystallization of what the Americans want to do. Certainly in terms of Hezbollah, there's new legislation being adopted by Congress, which is going to tighten existing sanctions. The spotlight is on the Lebanese banking system, for example. The Lebanese banks are very nervous at the moment about the possibility of being blacklisted by the US Treasury in case they're handling money that is somehow connected to Hezbollah, and there are other measures as well. So this is all fed into, help to heighten the speculation of another conflict coming.
I want to talk a little bit about this. Is a good segue into understanding how Hezbollah functions within Lebanese society. But to do that, I want to go back to some of the history of the context in which Hezbollah was founded. I mean, you wrote a book that goes well further back before the founding of Hezbollah, and what I found interesting is you start the story with the story of the Shia in Lebanon as the background to understanding how Hezbollah emerged. And you talk about them really as a marginalized minority that was underserved by the Lebanese state, suffering the effects of Israeli occupation. It gives a little bit of a different perspective than, how we experience Hezbollah today. Can you talk about the situation of the Shia in Lebanon then and now and how this has led to the growth of Hezbollah? And then I want to ask you from there how Hezbollah is seen by the rest of Lebanese society.
Yeah. Well, I mean, after Lebanon gained independence in 1943, and they have this kind of power-sharing pact, and it was essentially a Maronite-Sunni compromise to apportion the main roles of the state on a sectarian basis. So, the president is always a Maronite, the prime minister is always a Sunni, the parliamentary speaker is always a Shia, and so on. It's reflected down through the governmental system. So in the 40s, 50s, early 60s, the Shia community were mainly living in the rural areas of South Lebanon, the Bekaa Valley. The Shia society traditionally is very feudal. So you'd have your feudal barons to whom you pay, demonstrate your loyalty and so on. And it was pretty grim. These areas were underdeveloped by the successive governments in Beirut. Governments focused on developing Beirut and Mount Lebanon, the areas of mountains outside of Beirut. And these peripheral areas of the Bekaa Valley in the south were more or less left to fester. And this resulted in a lot of young Shia moving to Beirut because it was the only place they could get work. And they gradually settled in what is now known as Dahye, or the southern suburbs of Beirut, which was essentially a little Christian area, but it's now the third major area of Shia habitation in Lebanon, along with the south and the Bekaa. And you saw the wave of Arab nationalism that swept through the Middle East in the 50s and early 60s, and that caught up a lot of the young Lebanese Shia who identified with the Arab nationalist cause, overthrowing the despots and kind of the leftist causes, communism, socialism, Marxism, and so on, took root within that society. But at the same time, there was another dynamic at play, which was one more rooted in a kind of dynamic Shia Islam that ended up, I mean, we don't have to go into all these details, but there was organizations like Dawah that emerged in Iraq, and you had Lebanese Shia clerics going to the seminaries in Najaf in Iraq, being influenced by Mohammed Bakr al-Sadr and Ayatollah Khomeini, and the whole concept of the Vilayat al-Faqih, which later became the foundational governing system of the Islamic State of Iran.
And for our listeners, what does that refer to?
Essentially, this is a theory in which the person who is considered most knowledgeable in Islam, the Wali al-Faqih, becomes the supreme leader of an Islamic state and is the ultimate arbiter in terms of deciding how affairs of state are run. This is kind of different from the traditional, what is known as a quietist school of Shia Islam, where you have your religious leaders or marja, and they will guide a young Muslim how to interpret the Quran and Islam, but they stay out of interfering in daily politics. So the Iranian system was a little bit different. And this is the one that the system that Hezbollah subscribes to. But we had a gradual mobilization process of the Shia community in the late 1960s under the guidance of a guy called Imam Musa Sadr, who was an Iranian of Lebanese origin. And he was a very dynamic force, and he managed to galvanize the Shia, and he formed a movement which later became the Amal movement. And it was from this sense of mobilization combined with the followers, the Lebanese Shia followers of the Islamic Revolution in Iran in 1979, where their ideas were forming about forming this Islamic resistance against Israel. And these ideas came into effect after the 1982 Israeli invasion of Lebanon, and the Iranians recognized there as an opportunity to build an Islamic resistance against the Israeli occupation. And this is how it all began, from a very sort of grassroots basis into the huge monolith that we have now.
But you really raise one of the fundamental questions that I think is constantly being debated about Hezbollah. Is it really an Iranian grown organization, or is it truly Lebanese, or to what extent is it an Iranian kind of proxy in Lebanon? I mean, I've heard so many different characterizations of this relationship. How would you characterize it?
Well, strictly speaking, if you look at a flowchart, an organizational flowchart of Hezbollah's structure, it'll start with God, then it drops down to the Prophet Muhammad, and then it drops down to the Wali al-Faqih. Now, this is the guy who is seen as the most knowledgeable in Islam and whose orders must be obeyed. This is currently Ali Khamenei, the supreme leader of Iran. But it could be an impoverished Shia cleric living on a mountain somewhere in South America, theoretically. And the next position down is the Secretary General of Hezbollah. So this is an ideological strand rather than Hezbollah following the orders of Iranian leadership. Now, that's the sort of the bare bones basis. The pragmatic reality, of course, is that they are serving the interests of Iran as dictated by the Wali al-Faqih, or the supreme leader of Iran. But it's more complicated as well, because this is an organization that is drawn from Lebanese. It's Lebanese Shias that make up this organization. It's not Iranians that are involved in Hezbollah's composition. So when Hezbollah is following the orders of the Wali al-Faqih, they are following the orders of the Wali al-Faqih, not necessarily the orders of Iran, if you see what I mean. It's a fine distinction, right. And the net effect of all that is that they are following the orders of Iran.
Right. Well, let me ask you something else. I mean, at some points in our conversations, you've mentioned that Hezbollah became an extremely popular organization in general, and that at a certain point, Hassan Nasrallah was the most popular person in the Arab world. So apparently, something about Hezbollah has caught on beyond just the Shia Lebanese community. Can you explain that?
Yes, well, I mean, this was essentially in the 1990s, after the civil war ended in Lebanon. Hezbollah was given a carte blanche by the Syrians who were controlling Lebanon at that time to conduct their resistance campaign against the Israelis in South Lebanon. And they became increasingly successful. And it obviously culminated in May 2000, with the withdrawal of Israeli troops from South Lebanon. Which made them seem victorious, right? Which made them seem victorious, and indeed they were victorious. I mean, they achieved their aim of forcing Israel out unilaterally and unconditionally, which was always their goal. They didn't want to settle down and cut a deal at the end of the day. They wanted to chase them out. And, obviously Lebanon is a very divided society, a sectarian society. Christians in general, and back then to a certain extent Sunnis, would look at Hezbollah with a degree of suspicion. But there was a collective sense of partly pride, partly sort of admiration and support for what Hezbollah was doing in terms of the resistance. And they generated a lot of respect. They played their game very well, and they reached out to the Christians. In the 1996, I remember during the Grapes of Wrath operation, which was a major 2-week flare-up in South Lebanon, you would have Hezbollah donation vehicles, basically a car draped in the Hezbollah flag with a big bucket on the hood, driving slowly through the streets of Beirut so people could throw money into the bucket, donations. They were driving through Christian neighborhoods, and people were coming out and throwing money in the bucket, right, because they kind of supported what was going on. Inevitably, the problems for Hezbollah were going to set in at the moment of victory, when the Israelis are gone, how do you continue justifying resistance when there's no occupation left to resist? Well, in 2000, there was still the Sheba Farms area. There were still Lebanese detainees in Israeli jails, which gave them a kind of material justification. But more importantly, the Syrians were still calling the shots in Lebanon. Nevertheless, there was a gradual rising kind of viewpoint in Lebanon after 2000 that, well, you know, guys, you did a great job kicking the Israelis out, but really you should put down your weapons and leave it to the Lebanese army now.
Yeah,
but
thanks a lot, but
thanks,
you
but
can go
you're
home.
done. Yeah. But the Hezbollah could ignore essentially this kind of rising tide because they had the Syrian umbrella protecting them. Then in 2005, Rafiq Hariri, former Lebanese prime minister, is blown up. We have the anti-Syrian protests, the Beirut Spring that followed. And at the end of April, the Syrians politically disengaged from Lebanon and pulled their troops out. Suddenly, Hezbollah was more exposed. They'd lost the Syrian umbrella. And this is when they joined the government a couple of months later after elections for the very first time because they needed to take a step deeper into Lebanese politics to be able to protect their core interests, what they call their resistance priority.
But I think that also raised the question about whether they were going to take on governance and more political activity and become less of a militant organization. At least that was a question that was on the minds of Israelis. What happened in reality?
Their move into politics began in 92 after the parliamentary elections, first one after the Civil War. You have to bear in mind that when Hezbollah announced its existence in 1985, and they came out with their various ideological platforms, and one of them was a total rejection of the Lebanon's confessional political system. But at the end of the Civil War, and there was a kind of a debate within Hezbollah, look, you know, maybe we need to be a bit more pragmatic and to ensure our survival. The Syrians calling the shots here. Maybe we should stand candidates for the next elections. We don't have to agree in the political system, but we can act within it. And there was a big debate about this, and in the end, Ali Khamenei, in his role as the Wali al-Faqih, decreed that Hezbollah should stand candidates. There's no harm in joining parliament. And this is what happened. And they had a small but potent parliamentary role during the 1990s, but they didn't bother with government. They weren't interested. They didn't need to take that extra step. Their moves into parliament and then in 2005 into government are not because they wanted to take deeper steps into Lebanese politics and perhaps as a precursor for change, but it was there to protect their resistance priority. By the same extension, you can argue that their social welfare networks, which are huge and extensive, include schools, clinics, hospitals, charities. They're all there partly out of Islamic obligations for charity, which is one of the pillars of Islam, but also because it's a great hearts and mind operation. And you make a community of support dependent upon you.
Well beyond the Shia community is what you're saying.
Mainly focused on the Shia community, but it does go beyond. I mean, their hospitals are open to anyone. So all these extra activities, joining government, the parliamentary presence, the social welfare networks, they have a role to play individually anyway, but they're essentially there designed to protect and bolster the resistance priority, which is the military struggle against Israel. So in 2005, they joined the government, and then we've had really since then until about a little over a year ago, a decade of grinding political deadlock between these two powerful parliamentary blocs, one backed by the Americans and the Saudis, the other one led by Hezbollah, backed by Iran and Syria. And we had the 2006 war, of course, which raised Hezbollah's popularity a little bit, not in Lebanon, but where everything was very polarized, but around the region, people were sort of impressed with Hezbollah's performance. Then, of course, the war in Syria came, and Hezbollah was suddenly deploying their forces into Syria, and people were going, what? Hang on, these guys are supposed to be fighting the Israelis, the Zionists. What are they doing fighting in Syria? Why are they propping up the regime of Bashar al-Assad? This is an organization that has always spoken of fighting for the oppressed. Now they're siding with the oppressor in Syria.
And that's an internal dialogue in Lebanon.
That was the perception across the region in terms of Sunni eyes. The Sunnis across the region saw what was going on in Syria, and they've turned against Hezbollah. Right. It's no longer the party of God, Hezbollah. It's Hezbollah Shaitan, the party of the devil.
Well, that actually really raised a question. I mean, I've seen your articles on this, and this really raised a question in my mind, is whether the leadership of Hezbollah, realizing that their role in Syria has been so unpopular for them, assuming that the only way to get back that unity of spirit behind Hezbollah is to turn against Israel again, does that not raise the prospect of Hezbollah having an interest in a war with Israel?
Well, I think it's gone beyond that, to be honest. If there's another war between Hezbollah and Israel, I suspect a lot of Sunnis around the region will be cheering, well, if not cheering on Israel, certainly won't be cheering on Hezbollah.
Really?
Yeah, I think there is a fundamental break there. And also, I think that Hezbollah's leadership understood this when they started getting entangled in Syria. They didn't go into this, A, with eyes closed, and B, solely on the orders of Iran, because the survival of the Assad regime is as important to Hezbollah's position in Lebanon as it is to Iran's strategic priorities across the region. If Assad had fallen in the first year or two and been replaced by a new regime in Syria, better reflecting the Sunni majority demographic, it's going to put Hezbollah in a much more difficult position in Lebanon. The Sunnis in Lebanon will suddenly, look, Damascus has come back to us. It'll bolster them with confidence to start trying to push back against Hezbollah. And that could have actually been disastrous for Lebanon, potentially for Israel as a consequence. So going into Syria was not Nasrallah saying, yes, sir, and taking orders from the Iranians.
They were also trying to save their own skin.
This was a mutual decision to go in for their respective and shared interests.
So let me ask you one simple, short question to end. How can this apparently imminent war that is still somehow being deferred day to day but could explode any moment, how can this situation be de-escalated? Is there a way?
De-escalation, that's very difficult because you're looking at, there are too many factors to de-escalate. You're looking at potential US policy towards Iran. You're looking at the mess that is Syria. So you're not looking at one conflict in Syria, you're looking at multiple conflicts that you need to try to de-escalate. I think it's more a case of conflict management.
We're good at that.
Yes, well, I mean,
joking.
Look, at the end of the day, you've had 11 and a half years of basic stability along Israel's northern border, okay? So that's the longest period of calm northern Israel and southern Lebanon have experienced since the 1960s when the PLO turned up in South Lebanon. There's no reason why that couldn't last another decade. You've got the UN peacekeepers in South Lebanon.
Who you've argued are actually doing quite a good job at helping to manage the situation.
They're helping to manage. They have a limited amount of influence for sure, but in a very small, but I think important way, they are an interlocutor between Lebanon and Israel and, by extension, Hezbollah and Israel. And they are able to ease these little tactical hiccups that occur along the blue line from time to time that without that mediation effort could escalate into something more serious. I mean, I think that both sides would have to, in recognition that the next war is going to be so dangerous, so violent, so devastating for both sides, the Israelis and on one side and Iran and Hezbollah on the other, they have to be, I know they have their various agendas to fulfill, but they have to be so cautious in how they act with and against each other, because it is so easy for a minor incident to very rapidly get out of control and suddenly you're into a full-scale war before either side can dial it back. So the fewer actions taken by either side that could trigger a counter-action and then a counter-action that
the better.
Spirals into war. Absolutely.
In other words, you're recommending that we all just take a deep breath and walk on eggshells for a while. I'm all for it. That's Nicholas Blanford. He is the Beirut correspondent for the Christian Science Monitor, talking about his work on Hezbollah, Lebanon, including his book Warriors of God, Inside Hezbollah's 30-year war with Israel from 2011, as well as his book Killing Mr. Lebanon from 2006. Thank you for being on the show.
My pleasure. Thank you.
And now a request. Many or most of you listen to us on the Apple Podcasts apps, and we have a special request. Please consider writing us a review. Just launch the app, select our podcast in the library section, scroll down to ratings and review and press write a review, and then you actually have to write one. Thank you to Gizem Ozdemir, our sound engineer, to Itai Shelem, our producer, and to the Van Leer Institute for their generous support. Thanks also to Peter Frey and Carrie Shapiro of the Romay Foundation for their support. You too can support us by going to our website, tlv1.fm/Tel Aviv Review, and subscribing to our Patreon campaign. We've got gifts for you and lots of other incentives. Check out our archive with over 400 interviews. If you like us, you can like us on Facebook as well. Our page is called the Tel Aviv Review Podcast Ideas from Israel, and follow us on Twitter. Join us again next week for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review, and until then, goodbye.